The cold marble floor pressed against Trinity Johnson's knees as tears streamed down her face. Victor Sterling stood above her with his expensive shoes gleaming in the light and his cruel smile cutting deeper than any knife ever could. He held her work apron in his hand like it was trash and pointed to the floor where he had deliberately spilled coffee. "Crawl to that mess and clean it up like the dog you are," he said loud enough for everyone in the restaurant to hear. The other waiters froze in shock, and the wealthy customers at their tables looked away in shame, but nobody moved to help her. Trinity's hands trembled as she felt her dignity being stripped away piece by piece. But deep in her heart, something else was happening. A fire was being lit that would burn brighter than Victor Sterling could ever imagine. This was not the end of Trinity's story. This was just the beginning of the most remarkable comeback that would shake the entire restaurant industry and teach a powerful lesson about karma and justice. Trinity had walked into Pinnacle Heights restaurant just 3 days ago with hope in her eyes and determination in her heart. She was a single mother of 2 beautiful children named Marcus and little Zoe, who were waiting at home for her to bring back good news about her new job. After months of searching and dozens of rejection letters, Trinity finally got hired as a waitress at one of the most expensive restaurants in the entire city. The pay was good, and the tips were even better, which meant she could finally afford to move her family out of their tiny apartment with the leaking ceiling and broken heater. On her first day, she arrived 30 minutes early with her uniform pressed perfectly and her smile ready to serve. The other staff members seemed nice enough, but they all warned her about one person. "Be careful around Mr. Sterling," they whispered when the manager was not looking. "He owns half the restaurant chain, and he thinks he owns the people too." Trinity did not understand what they meant until that terrible morning when everything changed forever. It started when Trinity accidentally brushed past Victor Sterling while carrying a tray of water glasses to table 7. One glass wobbled slightly but did not fall, and not a single drop of water spilled anywhere. But Victor turned around with fury in his cold blue eyes and grabbed her arm so hard it left red marks on her skin. "You clumsy fool," he shouted, even though nothing had actually gone wrong. "Do you know who I am, and do you know what I could do to you?" Trinity apologized quickly and tried to move away, but Victor was not finished. He had been drinking expensive wine since breakfast, and his face was red with anger and something darker. Throughout the morning, he watched her like a hawk, waiting for any tiny mistake. When Trinity served coffee to a customer, Victor deliberately walked past and bumped her elbow, making the coffee spill on the white tablecloth. Then he called the manager over and demanded that Trinity be punished for her carelessness. The manager, Mr. Harrison, was a weak man who feared losing his job more than he cared about doing what was right. He told Trinity she would have to clean up the mess and apologize to Victor himself. That is when Victor made his cruel demand. "Cleaning up is not enough," he said with evil dancing in his eyes. "I want her to understand her place here, and I want everyone to see what happens when people like her forget where they belong." The restaurant went completely silent, and Trinity could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. "Get on your knees," he commanded, "and crawl to that spill like the worthless dog you are." Trinity looked at Mr. Harrison with pleading eyes, hoping he would stop this nightmare, but the manager looked at the floor and said nothing. The other waiters and waitresses stood frozen like statues, and the customers pretended to be very interested in their food. Trinity thought about her children at home and how much they needed this job. She thought about the bills piling up on her kitchen table and the electricity company's final warning notice. With tears burning her eyes, she slowly got down on her knees. The sound of her body hitting the floor echoed through the restaurant like a gunshot. She crawled 3 steps toward the spilled coffee while Victor laughed and made barking sounds. But then something inside Trinity snapped like a rubber band pulled too tight. Trinity stopped crawling and looked up at Victor with eyes that suddenly showed no fear at all. She stood up slowly, and with a voice that was quiet but strong as steel, she said, "I will not crawl for you or anyone else in this world. Victor's face turned purple with rage, and he screamed that she was fired and that he would make sure she never worked in this city again. Trinity took off her apron and placed it gently on the nearest table. She looked around at all the people who had watched her humiliation and said something that would be remembered forever. "My name is Trinity Johnson, and I am not a dog but a human being with dignity. Today you all watched evil happen and did nothing, but I promise you this. The universe has a way of balancing the scales, and truth always rises to the surface." With her head held high, Trinity walked out of Pinnacle Heights restaurant while every eye in the room followed her. She did not know how she would pay her rent or feed her children, but she knew she had kept something more valuable than any job. She had kept her soul. What Trinity did not know was that her words had been recorded on a customer's phone and were about to change everything. The customer who recorded the video was an elderly woman named Mrs. Patricia Coleman, who had been sitting quietly in the corner. She had watched the whole horrible scene with growing anger in her heart. Mrs. Coleman was not just any customer. She was a retired civil rights lawyer who had spent 50 years fighting for justice, and she knew wrong when she saw it. As soon as Trinity left the restaurant, Mrs. Coleman posted the video on her social media account with a caption that read, "This is what racism and cruelty look like in 2025, and this must never be acceptable." The video showed everything. It showed Victor's cruel words and Trinity's forced crawling and her powerful moment of standing up. Within 2 hours, the video had 10,000 views. Within 6 hours, it had 1 million views. By the next morning, it had been shared by news stations across the entire country, and Trinity Johnson's name was trending on every social media platform. People were furious. They demanded justice for Trinity and consequences for Victor Sterling and accountability from Pinnacle Heights restaurant. Trinity woke up the next morning to find hundreds of missed calls and messages on her phone. News reporters were standing outside her apartment building, and support was pouring in from people she had never met. A famous civil rights organization offered to represent her for free. A popular talk show host invited her to share her story on national television. Donations started coming in from people all over the country who wanted to help her feed her children while she looked for a new job. But the biggest surprise came in an email from someone Trinity never expected to hear from. It was from Mrs. Diane Richardson, who was the majority owner of the entire Pinnacle Heights restaurant chain and Victor Sterling's business partner. The email said, "Trinity, I saw what happened to you, and I am ashamed that this occurred in any business with my name attached. Please meet me tomorrow at my office because we need to talk." Trinity was nervous but curious, so she borrowed her neighbor's car and drove to the address in the email. She had no idea that this meeting would lead to the total destruction of Victor Sterling's empire. Mrs. Richardson was a tall woman with silver hair and eyes that had seen a lot of life. She welcomed Trinity into her beautiful office and offered her coffee and a comfortable chair. "Trinity, I have been business partners with Victor Sterling for 15 years, she began, "but I never knew the kind of man he truly was until yesterday. The video you were in has now been seen by 20 million people, and our restaurants are being boycotted across 12 states. Our stock value has dropped by 40% in just one day, and we are losing millions of dollars every hour. But that is not why I asked you here." Trinity listened carefully as Mrs. Richardson continued. "I asked you here because I want to make things right, and because I believe you deserve justice. After watching that video, I did some investigating, and I discovered that you are not Victor's first victim. There have been 17 other employees over the past 5 years who filed complaints about his behavior, but Victor paid them to stay quiet, and I never heard about any of it." Trinity felt her hands shaking as she realized how close she had come to being just another silent victim. Mrs. Richardson pulled out a thick folder and placed it on the desk between them. "This folder contains evidence of everything Victor has done," she said. "Harassment and discrimination and financial crimes, and even threats against people who tried to speak up. I have already contacted the authorities, and they are building a case against him. But I need your help, Trinity. I need you to testify about what happened to you, and I need you to be the face of the change this company desperately needs." Trinity looked at the folder, and then at Mrs. Richardson's sincere face. "Why should I help the company that let this happen to me?" she asked with pain still fresh in her voice. Mrs. Richardson nodded slowly. "You should not help the company," she answered. "You should help the 17 other victims who are watching to see if speaking up actually matters. You should help every person who has ever been humiliated at their job and told they were worthless. And you should do it because you have a power now that most people never get. You have the power to transform pain into purpose." Those words hit Trinity like lightning, and she knew in that moment what she had to do. The next few weeks were a whirlwind that Trinity could barely keep up with. She testified at hearings and spoke at press conferences and shared her story with anyone who would listen. The evidence against Victor Sterling was overwhelming, and the legal system moved faster than anyone expected. Victor was arrested and charged with multiple crimes, including assault and discrimination and fraud and witness intimidation. His assets were frozen, and his reputation was destroyed completely. The restaurants that still bore his name started removing his pictures from their walls. His so-called friends stopped returning his phone calls. Everything he had built through cruelty and fear came crashing down around him, like a house of cards in a strong wind. But Trinity was not satisfied with just watching him fall. She wanted to build something better from the ashes. With Mrs. Richardson's full support, Trinity proposed something revolutionary. She wanted to create a program within the Pinnacle Heights restaurant chain that would protect workers and give them a voice and train managers on dignity and respect. Mrs. Richardson loved the idea so much that she made Trinity the new director of employee dignity and workplace culture. The position came with a salary that was 10 times what Trinity had been making as a waitress. It also came with the power to fire anyone who treated employees poorly, including managers and executives. Trinity could hardly believe it, but she accepted the role with one condition. She wanted every employee in the company to know that they could report problems directly to her without fear, and that she would personally investigate every single complaint. Mrs. Richardson agreed immediately, and they shook hands on a partnership that would change thousands of lives. The first thing Trinity did was reach out to the 17 other victims of Victor's cruelty. She offered them jobs and counseling and public apologies from the company. She also created a fund using money from Victor's seized assets to compensate them for their pain. 16 of the 17 accepted, and they became the founding members of Trinity's new workplace dignity team. The media loved Trinity's story, and she became a symbol of courage for people everywhere. She was invited to speak at universities and conferences, and even at the United Nations, about workplace dignity and standing up against injustice. Magazine covers featured her face with headlines like, "From Humiliation to Transformation," and "The Waitress Who Brought Down a Billionaire." But Trinity stayed humble through it all. She never forgot where she came from or why she was doing this work. Every morning she would look at pictures of Marcus and Zoe and remind herself that she was fighting for a world where they would never have to crawl for anyone. She used her new platform to advocate for stronger worker protection laws and better training for managers and real consequences for workplace abuse. Politicians started listening and laws started changing. The Trinity Johnson Workplace Dignity Act was introduced in Congress, and it had support from both parties. Trinity had gone from crawling on a restaurant floor to shaping national policy in less than 6 months. But the story was not over yet, because Victor Sterling had one more card to play. From his jail cell waiting for trial, he gave an interview to a newspaper claiming that Trinity had planned the whole thing to get famous and rich. He said she had deliberately provoked him and that the video was taken out of context. His lawyers tried to paint him as the real victim of a social media mob. For a moment it seemed like public opinion might shift, because some people always want to doubt the victim and protect the powerful. Trinity was heartbroken when she saw the interview because she thought all her work might be undone by lies. But then something amazing happened. The 17 other victims all came forward together on live television. They told their stories one by one and showed evidence of what Victor had done to them over the years. Their testimony was so powerful and consistent that nobody could deny the truth anymore. Victor's lies crumbled, and the public supported Trinity even stronger than before. The trial was swift, and the verdict was guilty on all charges. Victor Sterling was sentenced to 12 years in prison and ordered to pay millions in restitution to his victims. On the day of the sentencing, Trinity sat in the courtroom and listened as the judge spoke directly to Victor. "You used your power to humiliate and abuse people who were just trying to earn an honest living," the judge said. "You thought your wealth and position put you above basic human decency, but today you learned that nobody is above justice." Trinity did not feel happy watching Victor being led away in handcuffs. She felt something else. She felt closure and peace and hope. After the trial, she stood on the courthouse steps and spoke to the crowd of reporters and supporters. "Today is not about revenge," she said in a voice that carried across the crowd. "Today is about accountability and healing and making sure this never happens to anyone else. I forgive Victor Sterling, not because he deserves it, but because I deserve peace. And I promise to spend the rest of my life making workplaces better for everyone." The crowd erupted in applause, and Trinity smiled with tears of joy running down her face. The Pinnacle Heights restaurant chain underwent a complete transformation under Trinity's guidance. Every location implemented her dignity program, and employee satisfaction scores went up by 80%. Customers came back because they knew the company had changed and the boycott ended. The stock price not only recovered, but climbed higher than it had ever been before. Mrs. Richardson credited Trinity with saving the company and told her that she was being considered for an even higher position. But Trinity had different plans. She announced that she was leaving Pinnacle Heights to start her own organization called the Trinity Johnson Foundation for Workplace Dignity. The foundation would work with companies across all industries to train managers and protect workers and investigate complaints. Mrs. Richardson became the foundation's first major donor, and dozens of other companies signed up to participate in the program. Trinity's dream of changing workplace culture across the entire country was becoming reality. She hired many of her fellow victims to work at the foundation, and together, they created training materials and policies and support systems that would help millions of workers. Marcus and Zoe watched their mother on television and felt so proud they could burst. Trinity had moved them into a beautiful house with a big backyard and enrolled them in great schools. But more important than the house or the money was the lesson Trinity taught them every single day. She told them that dignity is something nobody can take away unless you give it to them. She taught them that standing up for what is right is always worth it, even when it is scary. She showed them that one person with courage can change the world. Marcus said he wanted to be a lawyer when he grew up so he could fight for justice just like his mom. Little Zoe said she wanted to be like Mommy and help people feel safe at work. Trinity hugged them both and told them they could be anything they wanted as long as they treated people with respect and never let anyone make them feel small. The three of them would sit together at dinner, and Trinity would share stories about the people her foundation was helping. Every story reminded her why she had refused to stay on that floor. A year after the incident, Trinity was invited back to the original Pinnacle Heights restaurant where everything had happened. The staff wanted to honor her, and the location had been completely renovated. When Trinity walked through the door, the entire restaurant stood up and applauded. The new manager presented her with a plaque that read, "In honor of Trinity Johnson, whose courage changed everything." Trinity looked around at the faces of the workers and saw hope and dignity and pride. The cold marble floor where she had been forced to crawl was now covered with a beautiful carpet. Hanging on the wall was a large portrait of Trinity with the words "Stand Up for Dignity" written beneath it. Trinity gave a short speech thanking everyone and reminding them that they all had the power to create change. Then she did something surprising. She asked if she could work one shift as a waitress to remember where she came from. The staff loved the idea, and Trinity put on an apron and served customers for 3 hours. She laughed and joked and made sure every person felt welcomed. When the shift was over, she stood in the middle of the restaurant and felt complete peace. The story of Trinity Johnson spread around the world and inspired countless people to stand up against injustice. Workers in other countries started their own dignity movements using Trinity's foundation as a model. Schools began teaching her story as an example of courage and resilience. A movie studio bought the rights to make a film about her life, and Trinity insisted that part of the profits go to worker advocacy groups. She wrote a book called Never Crawl that became a bestseller and inspired millions of readers. In the book, she shared not just her story, but practical advice for anyone facing workplace abuse. She included resources and hotlines and legal information. The book helped people understand their rights and gave them courage to speak up. Trinity went on a book tour, and at every stop she met people who told her that her story had changed their lives. Some had quit abusive jobs, and others had reported harassment, and many had simply learned to value themselves more. Each conversation reminded Trinity that her pain had not been wasted. 5 years after that terrible day on the marble floor, Trinity received a letter that made her cry. It was from Victor Sterling, who was still in prison. The letter said, "Trinity, I have had a lot of time to think about what I did, and I am ashamed. I cannot undo the pain I caused you and the others, but I want you to know that I am sorry. I am getting counseling in here and trying to understand why I treated people so badly. I did not expect your forgiveness, but I needed you to know that you changed me too. Watching what you built from the ruins of what I destroyed has taught me more than any punishment could. You are a better person than I ever was, and I hope that when I get out, I can spend my remaining years trying to make amends." Trinity read the letter several times and felt a mix of emotions. She decided to write back, not because she owed Victor anything, but because forgiveness was part of her healing. Her letter was short. "Victor, I accept your apology, and I hope you find peace. Use your time to become the person you should have been all along." That was all she needed to say. Trinity's children grew up watching their mother change the world, and they learned that heroes do not wear capes. Heroes are ordinary people who refuse to accept wrong and who turn their pain into purpose. Marcus did become a lawyer, and he specialized in workers' rights cases. Zoe became a teacher who taught her students about dignity and respect and standing up for others. Both of them would tell people that their mother was their biggest hero, not because she became famous, but because she never forgot who she was. Trinity continued leading her foundation for many years and helped create lasting change in how companies treated their employees. She never sought fame or attention for herself, but used her platform to lift up others. She created scholarships for people from struggling backgrounds who wanted to work in human resources or management. She partnered with unions and advocacy groups and government agencies to strengthen worker protections. Every year on the anniversary of that terrible day, she would visit schools and share her story with young people to teach them about courage and dignity. The impact of Trinity's courage spread far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The Pinnacle Heights restaurant chain became known as the best place to work in the hospitality industry. Other companies copied their dignity program, and workplace culture improved across entire industries. Laws were changed to better protect workers from abuse and harassment. Victims of workplace mistreatment had more resources and support than ever before. All of this happened because one woman refused to crawl and chose to stand up instead. Trinity often thought about that moment on the floor and wondered what would have happened if she had stayed down. She realized that sometimes the worst moments in our lives are actually doorways to our greatest purpose. The humiliation she felt that day became the fuel for a movement that helped millions of people. She had been knocked down, but she got back up stronger. She had been told she was worthless, but she proved her infinite worth. She had been treated like a dog, but she rose like a phoenix. Trinity Johnson's story became a lesson taught in business schools and leadership programs around the world. Her life proved that dignity is not given by others, but claimed by ourselves. She showed that standing up for what is right might cost you in the short term, but it pays dividends forever. She demonstrated that one act of courage can inspire thousands of other acts of courage. She taught that justice may be delayed, but it is never denied to those who persist. Most importantly, she proved that no matter how powerless you feel in a moment, you always have the power to choose dignity over despair. Trinity never forgot the other workers who had whispered warnings to her on her first day. She never forgot Mrs. Coleman, who recorded the video, and Mrs. Richardson, who chose justice over profit. She never forgot the 17 victims who stood with her. She built her success on a foundation of community and solidarity and shared humanity. And every single day she thanked God for giving her the strength to stand up when the whole world was watching. The restaurant where it all happened eventually became a museum dedicated to workers' rights and dignity. The marble floor was preserved under glass as a reminder of what happened and why it must never happen again. School groups would visit and learn about Trinity's story and the importance of treating all people with respect, regardless of their job or status. Young people would stand where Trinity once crawled and make promises to themselves about the kind of people they would become. The museum displayed Trinity's original apron and the video that changed everything, and letters from thousands of people whose lives were touched by her courage. Trinity would visit sometimes and walk through quietly looking at the exhibits. She would see children learning about dignity and adults wiping tears from their eyes. She would feel grateful that her pain had been transformed into something beautiful and lasting. And she would remember that little girl inside her who had always known she was worth more than how she was treated. That little girl had grown into a woman who changed the world simply by refusing to forget her worth. That was Trinity Johnson's greatest triumph. Not destroying an empire, but building a legacy of dignity that would outlive them all. Years later, when the noise of headlines had faded to a steady hum and the work of change looked less like fireworks and more like sunrise, Trinity kept moving city to city, shop floor to boardroom, church basement to state capitol, teaching people to build dignity into policy, budgets, and everyday decisions until it felt as ordinary as breathing. She wrote model handbooks that replaced dusty binders, trained inspectors who listened first and cited second, and developed a dashboard that let any employee anonymously flag hazards or humiliation and receive a response within 48 hours. A small administrative miracle that made thousands feel seen. On weekends, she cooked big pots of jollof and macaroni for volunteers at the foundation, where Marcus now is steady. Thoughtful attorney with a dry sense of humor ran a legal clinic that won back wages by the millions. And Zoe, equal parts tenderness and thunder, built a youth fellowship that taught teenagers how to run meetings, argue policy respectfully, and write their first public records request. She accepted awards only when the stage let her hand the microphone to janitors, cashiers, warehouse pickers, dishwashers, and home care aides whose names rarely travel. Then watch them speak truth in voices that trembled at first, and then did not tremble at all. When a recession hit and some executives whispered that dignity is a luxury line item, Trinity answered with data and stories, proving that well-rested, respected workers make fewer errors and spark more ideas. And she convinced 3 governors and 200 mayors to tie public contracts to dignity audits, turning the moral case into a competitive advantage. On a rainy spring, she returned to her childhood block and helped convert a vacant lot into a training kitchen and microgrant hub for single parents, where every graduate left with a job offer, a savings plan, and a mentor who texted, "Proud of you," after each threshold crossed. When the International Labor Council drafted a global right to respect charter, they asked Trinity to chair it. And she argued for plain language over legal fog, so a 20-year-old in their first job could read it on a phone during a short break and know exactly what protections were theirs. She still answered emails late, still paused to breathe before hard conversations, still kept a shoebox of thank you notes in her closet for days the work felt like pushing a river back with a broom. Notes from people who wrote, "Your training stopped my manager from mocking my accent. Your hotline helped me keep my pregnancy in my position. Your example convinced me to file the report I was afraid to file." When a sensational scandal elsewhere tried to borrow her name and twist it, Trinity refused the spectacle and chose patient explanation, reminding cameras that justice is work, not a brand, and then returning always to the slow, measurable tasks that change lives. Years spun, seasons folded into one another. And one winter afternoon she walked with Mrs. Coleman, frailer now but sharp as ever, through the Workers' Rights Museum, where a new wing honored bystanders who chose courage. And the two women stood before a simple plaque: "If you can see, you can act." And Mrs. Coleman squeezed Trinity's hand and whispered, "I'm still recording." When Mrs. Richardson retired, she endowed a scholarship in Trinity's name for frontline employees studying leadership. And the first cohort included a former line cook who redesigned scheduling to end the cruelty of surprise double shifts, a hotel housekeeper who pioneered safer chemical standards, and a supermarket cashier who built a conflict de-escalation program now used in 3 countries. There were setbacks, of course, an executive who tried to hide violations under software jargon, a union leader who forgot that dignity must flow sideways as well as up, a court decision that narrowed a hard-won rule, but each time Trinity gathered allies, adjusted the playbook, and kept going, measuring progress not by perfection, but by the number of ordinary days made kinder. On the 10th anniversary of the Marble Floor Day, she spoke in the restaurant-turned-museum to a crowd that spilled onto the sidewalk, telling them how courage often arrives disguised as a quiet no, and how the most important audience, in any hard moment, is the person you must live with afterward, your own reflection. After the speech, she slipped away to the kitchen where a new generation of workers compared notes about tip equity and emergency childcare. And she listened, asked better questions, and left with a list of changes to pursue, because celebration, she believed, is pointless if it does not refuel responsibility. When Marcus argued his first case before the Supreme Court on whistleblower protections, Trinity sat behind him, fingers laced, hearing echoes of every worker she had met. And when Zoe launched an elementary school curriculum called Respect in Action that turned playground conflicts into empathy labs, Trinity cried in the 3rd row and sent a thank you to the teacher who had once slipped her an extra lunch when money ran thin. She found love again. Not the cinematic thunderclap, but a steady lighthouse, someone who brewed tea during late-night drafting sessions and told her jokes so ridiculous she laughed until she forgot the day's hardness, and together they hosted Sunday dinners where debate was welcome and phones stayed in a bowl by the door. In her quiet hours, Trinity kept a ritual. She reread the transcript of her courthouse speech and the simple letter she had mailed to Victor, reminding herself that mercy and accountability can share a table without spilling each other's cups. When Victor was released and asked to volunteer at a reentry program, Trinity granted permission to use her forgiveness letter as a teaching text. And when a young man there said, "So you're saying I'm not the worst thing I've done?" Trinity nodded and replied, "You're the next good thing you choose." And the room exhaled. As the Foundation's 20th year approached, Trinity turned succession into a class, not a secret, teaching staff how to replace her long before anyone had to. And when she finally stepped down, the transition was so smooth critics had nothing to clutch at. Retirement, for her, meant fewer flights and more front porches, more neighborhood walks where strangers became neighbors and neighbors became friends, And on warm evenings she would sit under a sky that had watched her crawl and rise and build, listening to children skate past and to an old couple argue lovingly about card rules, feeling the quiet satisfaction of a life spent converting pain into policy, humiliation into help, fear into a door held open. Sometimes she dreamed of the marble floor and woke with her heart racing, but in the dream, now she stood up sooner. And when she looked around the room, she saw every person who had ever chosen dignity because she once chose it, an invisible choir of ordinary bravery humming in her bones. And when people asked for the short version of her philosophy, the distillation of a long, long road, she said, "Start small, stand firm, invite others." And then she smiled because the truth is not complicated, only costly. At a final public lecture, she ended with Marcus and Zoe seated beside her. Voices braided across generations, and as the audience rose, Trinity thought of that first morning light after the worst day of her life, the way it had touched the rim of a chipped coffee mug and made it glow, and she understood, finally, that the world does not change all at once. It changes the way morning happens, unnoticed, then undeniable, and always, always worth staying awake for.